program. In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where whispered conversations can topple kingdoms and casual remarks reshape centuries of tradition, one overheard conversation would ignite a fire that burned through the very heart of the British royal family. It was a moment that proved words, once spoken, can never truly be taken back, especially when they carry the weight of royal blood and the sting of brutal honesty. Edward, the youngest son who had always lived in shadows, found himself holding a secret that could destroy relationships, shatter carefully constructed public images, and expose the raw human emotions behind the crown's polished facade. What he heard Charles say about Catherine and Camilla wasn't just palace gossip. It was a revelation that would force him to choose between family loyalty and moral conscience. This is the story of how a single conversation caught between duty and truth would unravel years of carefully managed royal diplomacy and reveal that even those born to rule are painfully, devastatingly human. Some words are meant to stay buried in the shadows of power, but sometimes someone decides they deserve to see the light. Edward had always been the forgotten prince, the one who slipped through palace corridors unnoticed while his older brothers commanded attention in headlines. At 58, he had grown comfortable with his invisibility within the royal family. It allowed him certain freedoms that his brothers never enjoyed. That autumn afternoon in 2023, this invisibility would become both a curse and an unexpected gift. The late October rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence House as Edward made his way through the familiar hallways. He had come to discuss the details of his upcoming charity gala with Charles, who had finally agreed to serve as patron after months of gentle persuasion. The king's schedule was notoriously packed, but Charles had promised him 20 minutes between his meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury and his departure for Scotland. As Edward approached Charles' private study, he could hear voices through the partially open door. At present, his brother's distinctive voice carried clearly, along with another he recognized as Camilla's private secretary, Amanda. Edward paused, his hand hovering over the door handle. Protocol dictated he should announce himself, but something in Charles's tone made him hesitate. The public still doesn't fully accept Camilla, and Catherine's popularity makes that even more challenging, Charles was saying, his voice carrying a weariness that Edward rarely heard. Sometimes I wonder if we're fighting a battle we can never truly win. His conscience warring with curiosity. His conscience warring with curiosity. He had stumbled into something private, something clearly not meant for outside ears. Yet he couldn't bring himself to either enter or leave. Your Majesty, the polling numbers from last month show significant improvement, Amanda replied diplomatically. The Queen Consort's approval ratings have risen steadily since the coronation. Yes, but look at the comparison figures, Charles continued, and Edward could hear papers rustling. Catherine consistently polls in the 80s. Camilla struggles to reach 50%. The public sees Catherine as the future, young, beautiful, relatable. They see Camilla as the past, as the woman who, well, we all know the narrative that persists. Edward pressed himself closer to the wall, his heart racing. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could damage relationships and create headlines if it ever became public. He should leave, he knew that. But something about his brother's vulnerable honesty kept him rooted in place. The irony, Charles said, and Edward could hear him moving around the room, probably pacing as he did when deep in thought, is that Catherine gets credit for qualities that Camilla actually possesses. Camilla is the one who has stood by my side through everything. She's the one who understands the weight of this role, who has sacrificed everything for duty. Catherine is still learning. She's still finding her place. But the public perception, Amanda began. The public perception is what it is, Charles interrupted, his voice taking on an edge that Edward recognized from childhood arguments. But sometimes I think about what Catherine would do if she faced what Camilla faced. Would she have the strength? Would she have the grace? I honestly don't know. Catherine has never been tested the way Camilla was tested. She's never had to endure the hatred, the scrutiny, the decades of being painted as a villain. Edward felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just royal politics. This was personal, raw emotion spilling out in a way he had never heard from his brother before. Catherine gets praised for every small gesture, Charles continued, his voice growing stronger, more passionate. She waves at children and she's hailed as the people's princess. She wears an accessible dress and she's celebrated as relatable. But what has she actually sacrificed? What has she actually risked? She married into this family when the path was already cleared, when the public was ready to love her. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Edward could hear his own heartbeat in the stillness. "I'm not saying Catherine isn't capable," Charles added, his tone softening slightly. "I'm saying she's never had to prove it the way Camilla did. And yet Camilla is the one who gets criticized, who gets compared unfavorably at every turn. Sometimes I think Catherine should experience what Camilla experienced. Maybe then people would understand what real strength looks like." Edward felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. These weren't just private thoughts. They were potentially explosive opinions that could shatter the carefully maintained harmony between the different branches of the royal family. William and Catherine had worked tirelessly to build their public image, to position themselves as the modern face of the monarchy. Charles' words, if they ever became public, would be seen as a direct attack on that image. "Your Majesty," Amanda said carefully, "perhaps we should focus on highlighting the Queen Consort's positive contributions rather than making comparisons." "Of course," Charles replied, and Edward could hear the practiced diplomatic tone returning to his voice. "You're absolutely right. I'm just frustrated sometimes with how the narrative gets shaped. Camilla deserves better than she gets." B.M. passes, approaching the door, and quickly stepped back, pretending to have just arrived. He knocked softly and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," Charles called out, and when Edward pushed open the door, he found his brother seated behind his desk, looking perfectly composed. Amanda was gathering papers, preparing to leave. "Bye. I hope I'm not interrupting," Edward said, forcing normalcy into his voice. "Not at all," Charles replied, gesturing for him to sit. Amanda was just leaving. "We were discussing some upcoming engagements." As Amanda excused herself and left the room, Edward settled into the chair across from Charles's desk. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had heard and what it meant. The conversation he had just witnessed revealed layers of family dynamics that he had never fully understood. "You look troubled," Charles observed, studying his younger brother's face. "Is everything all right with the gala preparations?" Edward forced himself to focus on the reason for his visit, but the words he had overheard kept echoing in his mind. The gala details seemed suddenly trivial compared to the weight of what he now knew. "Everything's on track," Edward managed to say. "The venue is confirmed, the guest list is finalized, and the catering is arranged. We just need to go over your speech and the timing for your arrival." They spent the next 15 minutes discussing logistics, but Edward found himself studying his brother's face, looking for signs of the emotional turmoil he had witnessed moments before. Charles appeared completely in control, discussing timing and protocol with his usual attention to detail. It was as if the vulnerable conversation with Amanda had never happened. "I think that covers everything," Charles said finally, glancing at his watch. "I'm sorry to cut this short, but I have to prepare for my flight to Edinburgh. Thank you for making time for this." As Edward made his way back through the corridors of Clarence House, his mind churned with the implications of what he had heard. He had always known that family relationships within the royal family were complex, shaped by duty, tradition, and public expectation as much as by personal affection. But he had never realized the depth of Charles's feelings about the public's treatment of Camilla, or his apparent reservations about Catherine's untested character. The rain had stopped by the time Edward reached his car, but the gray October sky seemed to mirror his unsettled mood. As his driver pulled away from Clarence House, Edward stared out at the London streets, his mind wrestling with questions he had never had to face before. What was his responsibility now that he possessed this knowledge? Charles had spoken in what he believed was privacy, expressing thoughts and feelings that were clearly not meant for public consumption. But these weren't just personal opinions. They were views that could potentially damage relationships within the family and create a public relations disaster if they ever became known. Edward thought about William and Catherine, about how hard they had worked to build their reputation and prepare for their future roles. They had endured their own challenges and criticism, particularly during the early years of their relationship. Catherine had been subjected to years of intense media scrutiny, waiting for William to propose, dealing with speculation about every aspect of her life and background. Perhaps Charles had forgotten those struggles, or perhaps he didn't consider them comparable to what Camilla had endured. But Edward also thought about Camilla, about the decades she had spent as a figure of public contempt, blamed for the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. that was visceral and personal, had been portrayed as a villain in one of the most watched royal dramas in modern history. Even after her marriage to Charles, even after years of dedicated service, she still faced criticism in comparison to Diana's memory. The complexity of the situation weighed on Edward as his car navigated through London traffic. He had always prided himself on staying out of royal politics, on maintaining good relationships with all members of his family. His role had traditionally been that of the peacemaker, the one who could move between different family factions without taking sides. But now he possessed information that could potentially explode that carefully maintained neutrality. If Charles's words ever became public, they would inevitably be seen as taking sides in a way that could damage the monarchy's stability. The media would seize on any sign of division within the royal family, particularly anything that suggested criticism of William and Catherine, who were widely seen as the monarchy's future. Yet Edward also recognized the human element in what he had overheard. Sir Charles's words hadn't been calculated or political. They had been the expression of a husband's frustration and loyalty. He loved Camilla and was pained by what he saw as her unfair treatment by the public and media. His comments about Catherine hadn't been malicious, but rather the result of protective feelings for his wife. As Edward's car pulled up to his own residence, he realized that his comfortable invisibility within the family had suddenly become a burden. Knowledge, he was learning, could be as heavy as any crown. He had always envied his brothers their central roles in the monarchy, their importance to the institution's future. But now he understood that sometimes being peripheral had its own challenges, particularly when that position allowed you to see and hear things that perhaps you shouldn't. The evening stretched ahead of him, but Edward knew that sleep would be difficult. The sides had accidentally overheard would replay in his mind, each word carrying weight and implication. He had become an unwitting keeper of royal secrets, and he had no roadmap for how to bear that responsibility. In the days that followed, Edward found himself watching family interactions with new eyes. At public events, he observed the dynamics between Charles and William, between Camilla and Catherine. The polite smiles and coordinated appearances took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of what he now knew. The upcoming family Christmas gathering at Sandringham suddenly seemed fraught with potential tension. Would Charles's private feelings show in his interactions with Catherine? Would Camilla sense the undercurrent of comparison that Charles clearly felt? Would William pick up on any subtle changes in his father's behavior? Edward realized that his accidental eavesdropping had transformed him from a passive observer of family dynamics into someone who possessed potentially dangerous knowledge. The question that haunted him was simple but profound. What was he supposed to do with what he knew? The weekend at Anmare Hall began with deceptive normalcy. William and Catherine greeted their guests with genuine warmth, their children running freely through the gardens, creating the kind of authentic family atmosphere that was impossible to achieve at more formal royal residences. Edward watched as Charles played with his grandchildren, lifting Princess Charlotte onto his shoulders, while Prince George showed him a collection of leaves they had gathered. "It's wonderful to see him so relaxed," Camilla commented to Edward as they watched from the terrace. During official engagements, these private moments with the children are precious to him. Edward nodded, struck by the genuine affection in Camilla's voice. She clearly loved seeing Charles happy and unburdened, which made Edward's knowledge of his brother's private frustrations about her public reception even more painful to bear. But they passed pleasantly, with casual conversations over meals and long walks through the Norfolk countryside. Catherine was in her element as hostess, moving effortlessly between caring for her children, ensuring her guests were comfortable, and participating in the kind of relaxed conversation that would never occur at official events. During dinner, the conversation turned to recent charity work and upcoming royal engagements. Catherine spoke passionately about her early childhood development initiatives, describing recent visits to various programs and her hopes for expanding support for young families. "It's remarkable how much you've accomplished in this area," Charles said, and Edward studied his brother's expression carefully. Public response has been overwhelmingly positive. "Thank you," Catherine replied, her face glowing with genuine enthusiasm. "It's work that feels deeply meaningful to me. I know I'm fortunate to have this platform to make a difference." Edward noticed how Charles nodded approvingly at Catherine's response, seeming to appreciate both her passion and her acknowledgement of her privileged position. There was no hint of the reservations he had expressed privately about her character or experience. The conversation continued with William describing his work with homelessness initiatives and mental health awareness. As the family discussed their various causes and commitments, Edward was struck by the genuine dedication they all showed to their public service roles. Whatever private tensions existed, they were united in their commitment to using their positions constructively. Later, that evening after the children had been put to bed, the adults gathered in William and Catherine's comfortable sitting room. The atmosphere was relaxed, with everyone settled into overstuffed chairs and sofas, glasses of wine in hand. "I was thinking about Mummy earlier," William said quietly, his gaze moving to a photograph of Diana that sat on one of the side tables. She would have loved seeing her grandchildren here, playing in the gardens. Edward noticed how Camilla's expression became carefully neutral, while Charles reached over to squeeze her hand gently. "She would indeed," Charles said softly. She loved family gatherings like this. The informality, the laughter, watching children just be children. "I think about her often when I'm with the children," Catherine added. "I wish they could have known her. I try to tell them stories about their grandmother, about how much she would have loved them." In code, with fascination and growing unease. Catherine's comments about Diana seemed entirely natural and appropriate, showing respect for William's mother and acknowledging her importance to the grandchildren she never met. But Edward couldn't help wondering if Charles heard these words through the filter of his private comparisons between Catherine and Camilla. "You do that beautifully," Camilla said to Catherine, her voice warm and sincere. "The children should know about Diana's love for them, and you tell those stories with such care."
"Thank you," Catherine replied. "I know it can be
sensitive. I never want to overstep, but I also don't want them to grow up without knowing about the grandmother they lost." "There's no overstepping," William assured her. "You handle it perfectly. You honor Mummy's memory while helping the children understand their family history." Edward felt increasingly uncomfortable as he watched this exchange. On the surface, it was a touching conversation about family, memory, and the careful way they navigated Diana's legacy. But knowing what he knew about Charles's private thoughts added layers of complexity that made every word feel charged with hidden meaning. The second day of the weekend brought a change in weather, with rain keeping everyone inside for most of the morning. The enforced proximity created more opportunities for conversation, but also more potential for the kind of unguarded moments that Edward had learned to fear. While William was on a phone call with his private secretary about upcoming engagements, Catherine, Camilla, and Sophie found themselves discussing the challenges of royal life over coffee in the kitchen. Edward, retrieving a book he had left on the kitchen counter, found himself once again in the position of accidental eavesdropper. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still learning the rules," Catherine was saying with a self-deprecating laugh. "Even after all these years, there are moments when I worry I'm going to make some terrible mistake." "We all feel that way sometimes," Sophie assured her. "The protocol can be overwhelming, and there's always the fear of putting a foot wrong." "But you both came into this as adults," Camilla said thoughtfully. "You had time to understand what you were choosing. I sometimes think about how different it must be for those who were born into it, who never had the option to choose a different life." Edward paused in his search for his book, struck by Camilla's words. There was something in her tone that suggested deeper reflection about the nature of royal duty and choice. "I think about that too," Catherine said. "William never had a choice about his eventual role, but I did. I chose this life, chose these responsibilities. In some ways, that makes it easier. I can't feel resentful about something I actively chose." "But it also means you carry the weight of that choice," Camilla replied. "You have to live with the knowledge that you could have had a different, perhaps easier life. That's its own kind of pressure." Edward found his book but remained still, fascinated by this unusually frank conversation between the three women. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked quietly. "The choice to marry into all of this?" There was a long pause before Camilla answered. "There have been moments," she said finally, "particularly during the difficult years when the public hatred was intense. There were times when I wondered if Charles would have been better off with someone who came with less baggage, less controversy." Died. "Oh, Camilla," Sophie said softly. "But those feelings passed," Camilla continued. "What I've learned is that we can't control how we're perceived by the public. We can only control how we conduct ourselves, how faithfully we serve, how genuinely we commit to the role." "You've been an incredible example of that," Catherine said warmly. The way you've handled everything, the dignity you've maintained, it's been inspiring to watch. Edward felt a complex mix of emotions as he listened to this exchange. Catherine's words of support for Camilla seemed entirely genuine, making Charles's private reservations about Catherine's character seem increasingly unfair. Here was Catherine, privately praising Camilla's strength and resilience, apparently unaware that her father-in-law questioned whether she possessed similar qualities. The conversation was interrupted by William's return, and Edward used the moment to quietly retrieve his book and slip away, but the words he had heard continued to resonate as the day progressed. That evening brought the weekend's most challenging moment. After dinner, Charles suggested they all play a game that had been a family favorite for years, a kind of modified charades where players had to act out famous historical figures. It was silly and fun, the kind of activity that usually brought out everyone's playful side. The game progressed with much laughter and good-natured teasing. William's attempt to portray Napoleon was particularly amusing, while Sophie's rendition of Queen Victoria had everyone in stitches. When it was Catherine's turn, she drew a card and studied it with a slight frown. "Oh dear," she said, looking up with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. "This might be a bit awkward." "You suffer." She began her performance, clearly portraying a woman in distress, covering her face with her hands and then gesturing as if speaking to crowds of people. Her movements were graceful and expressive, telling a story of someone who had captured public attention and sympathy. "Diana," Charlotte called out immediately, and Catherine nodded with a mixture of relief and slight embarrassment. "Well done, darling," William said, seeming genuinely impressed with his wife's tactful handling of a potentially awkward moment. But Edward noticed something else in that moment, a fleeting expression that crossed Charles's face. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by polite applause for Catherine's performance. But for just a second, Edward thought he saw something that looked like evaluation, as if Charles were measuring Catherine's handling of the Diana reference against some internal standard. Was Charles thinking about his private comments regarding Catherine's untested character? Was he wondering if Catherine's graceful handling of the awkward moment represented genuine strength, or simply good training and natural diplomacy? Edward found himself studying Charles's face for the rest of the evening, looking for other signs of the complex feelings he knew his brother harbored. But Charles appeared entirely normal, participating in the game with enthusiasm and praising everyone's performances equally. The weekend concluded on Sunday afternoon with the usual round of farewells and thank yous. As Edward prepared to leave, William pulled him aside for a private moment. "I hope you enjoyed the weekend," William said. Catherine was particularly pleased to have everyone here. She loves hosting these informal gatherings. "It was wonderful," Edward replied honestly. "Catherine is a natural hostess. You're both very fortunate to have found each other."
"We are," William agreed, his face soft with contentment.
Jusira Sekera. She's been incredible, not just as a wife, but as a partner in all of this. I couldn't ask for better support in facing whatever lies ahead. Bide, struck again by the contrast between William's complete confidence in his wife and Charles's private reservations. As he made his final farewells and settled into his car for the drive home, Edward felt more burdened than ever by the knowledge he carried. The weekend had shown him the complexity of family dynamics in even clearer detail. He had witnessed genuine affection and mutual respect between family members, along with the careful navigation of sensitive topics and potential tensions. Catherine had appeared entirely comfortable in her role, gracious as a hostess, respectful of family history, and supportive of other family members. Yet Edward couldn't shake the feeling that Charles had been watching and evaluating throughout the weekend, measuring Catherine's words and actions against his private expectations and comparisons. The knowledge of Charles's hidden feelings had transformed what should have been a pleasant family gathering into an exercise in reading subtext and hidden meanings. As Edward's car made its way through the Norfolk countryside, he realized that his secret knowledge was no longer just a burden. It was actively changing how he experienced family relationships. He was seeing tensions and evaluations where none might exist, reading meaning into ordinary interactions because he possessed information that others didn't have. The question that haunted him as he returned to his own life was whether he could continue to carry this knowledge in silence, or whether the weight of secrets would eventually force him to make a choice that could change everything. Decision, when it came, arrived with unexpected swiftness during the most routine of circumstances. Edward had been carrying his secret for nearly 6 months, watching it slowly poison his enjoyment of family gatherings and color every interaction with hidden meanings. He had convinced himself that he could continue indefinitely, that the burden of knowledge was something he would simply learn to bear. But on a crisp February morning in 2024, everything changed with a single phone call. Edward was in his study, reviewing correspondence about upcoming charity commitments, when his private secretary announced that Catherine was on the line. It was unusual for her to call directly. Most family communications went through private secretaries and formal channels. "Catherine," he said warmly as he took the call. "Lovely to hear from you. How are the children?" "They're well, thank you," Catherine replied, but Edward could hear something strained in her voice. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wondered if we might have a conversation, in person if possible." Edward felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Over the months since overhearing Charles's private comments, he had developed an almost superstitious fear of unexpected family conversations. "Of course," he said. "Is everything all right?" It's complicated," Catherine said after a pause. "I'd prefer not to discuss it over the phone, if you don't mind. Could we perhaps meet for coffee tomorrow? Somewhere private?" They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Mayfair that Edward knew was frequented by people who understood the value of discretion. As he hung up the phone, Edward felt a growing sense of dread. Catherine's tone had been troubled, almost vulnerable, in a way he had never heard from her before. The next morning, Edward arrived at the cafe early and secured a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. When Catherine arrived, he was struck by how different she looked from her usual composed self. She was still impeccably dressed and perfectly groomed, but there was something in her expression that spoke of deep concern. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as she settled into her chair. "I know this is unusual, but I didn't know who else to talk to about this." Edward felt his stomach drop. "What's troubling you?" Catherine stirred her coffee absently, clearly struggling with how to begin. "I've become aware of some concerns about my role in the family. About whether I'm meeting expectations." "Concerns from whom?" Edward asked carefully, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I can't say exactly," Catherine replied, looking up at him with troubled eyes. "But I've heard suggestions that there are questions about my character, about whether I truly understand the sacrifices required for this role, whether I have the strength that others have shown." Edward felt as if the world had shifted around him. Somehow, some version of Charles's private comments had reached Catherine. The secret he had guarded so carefully was apparently no longer secret. "Catherine," he said gently, "who told you this?" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is whether it's true. Am I seen as weak compared to others? Do people think I've had it too easy, that I haven't been properly tested?" Edward realized he was facing the moment he had dreaded for months. Catherine was asking him directly about concerns that he knew were real, because he had overheard them firsthand. He could lie, could reassure her that such concerns didn't exist, or he could find a way to acknowledge what she had heard while trying to provide context and support. "Catherine," he said slowly, "every member of this family faces questions and comparisons. It's the nature of public life. The important thing is how you conduct yourself, how you serve, and how you support the people who matter to you." "Be questions," Catherine said, her voice becoming more urgent. "These were specific concerns from within the family. Questions about whether I would handle adversity the way others have, whether I understand what real sacrifice looks like." Edward felt the weight of his months of secret knowledge pressing down on him. Catherine was clearly in distress, seeking answers about concerns that he knew were legitimate because he had heard them expressed directly. "What do you want me to tell you?" he asked quietly. Catherine looked at him with desperate honesty. "I want you to tell me the truth. If there are concerns about my strength or character, I need to know. If I'm being compared unfavorably to others, I need to understand why so I can address it." Edward stared at his coffee cup, wrestling with the decision that would define not just this conversation, but potentially the future of family relationships. Catherine deserved honesty, but providing it would mean betraying Charles's confidence and potentially creating a crisis within the royal family. "There may be some who wonder whether your path to this role has been different from others," he said finally, choosing his words very carefully. "Whether your experiences have prepared you for all the challenges you might face. Because I haven't been hated the way Camilla was hated. Because the public accepted me more easily. They're articulate how precisely Catherine had identified the core of Charles's concerns. Who have you been talking to? It doesn't matter, Catherine said again. What matters is that these concerns exist, and I need to understand them. Do you think they're justified?
Edward found himself at the crossroads he had been avoiding for months.
Catherine was asking for his honest assessment, not just of family politics, but of her character and capabilities. She was vulnerable and seeking truth, even if that truth might be painful. I think, Edward said slowly, that you have shown tremendous grace and commitment in your role. I think you've handled every challenge with dignity and strength. But I also think that some challenges reveal different qualities than others, and it's natural for people to wonder how someone might respond to situations they haven't yet faced.
Like what situations?
Catherine asked. Edward took a deep breath. Like being genuinely hated by large portions of the public for years. Like being blamed for destroying a beloved marriage. Like having every action interpreted through a lens of hostility and suspicion. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. You're talking about what Camilla experienced. Among other things, yes. Among other things, yes. And the question is whether I would handle that kind of sustained attack with the same strength she showed. Edward nodded reluctantly. That seems to be part of the concern. Catherine sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful rather than hurt. It's a fair question, isn't it? I have been fortunate in my public reception. The media and public have been largely supportive, even during difficult moments. I haven't been tested in the way Camilla was tested. Edward was surprised by Catherine's measured response. He had expected tears or anger, but instead she seemed to be genuinely considering the validity of the concerns raised about her. But here's what I don't understand, Catherine continued. Why are these concerns being discussed behind my back rather than with me? If there are doubts about my character or capabilities, shouldn't they be addressed directly? Family dynamics are complicated, Edward said carefully. Sometimes people express private concerns or frustrations that they would never voice publicly or formally. Private concerns to whom? Catherine pressed. Who exactly is questioning my character? Edward realized that his careful navigation around the truth was becoming impossible to maintain. Catherine was too intelligent and too direct to be deflected indefinitely. Catherine, he said slowly, I think you need to consider whether knowing the specific source of these concerns would be helpful or harmful to your family relationships.
You know who it is, Catherine said, and it wasn't a question.
Edward remained silent, but his expression apparently confirmed her suspicion. It's Charles, isn't it? She said quietly. Edward felt his carefully maintained neutrality crumble in the face of Catherine's direct question and obvious distress. Catherine, please, she said. I need to know. If my father-in-law has concerns about my character or fitness for this role, I need to understand what they are so I can address them. Edward looked at Catherine's face, saw the genuine pain and confusion there, and made a decision that he knew would change everything. I overheard a conversation, he said quietly. Several months ago, Charles was speaking privately about the differences between your experience and Camilla's, about whether you had been tested in the same way she had been. Palace went very still. What exactly did he say? Edward felt as if he were stepping off a cliff, but Catherine's obvious distress and her direct questions had made continued evasion impossible. He expressed frustration with how the public perceives Camilla compared to you. He wondered whether you would have the same strength if you faced what she faced. He suggested that maybe you should experience what Camilla experienced so people would understand what real strength looks like. Profound. Catherine stared at Edward as if processing something fundamental about her place in the family and the nature of her relationships. He thinks I'm weak, she said finally. I think he was expressing frustration about Camilla's treatment and wondering about untested strength, Edward replied carefully. But Catherine, these were private thoughts expressed in a moment of frustration. They don't necessarily reflect his overall feelings about you or your role. But Edward could see that she was deeply shaken by what she had learned. Who else knows about this conversation? As far as I know, just me. And now you. William doesn't know?
No, I don't believe anyone else was meant to hear those comments.
Catherine was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what Edward had told her. Finally, she looked up at him with the expression of sad resolution.
Thank you for being honest with me, she said. I know this wasn't easy for you to share. Catherine, what will you do with this information?
She stood up from the table, gathering her coat and handbag with the practiced efficiency that had become second nature to her over the years.
I'm going to think very carefully about what kind of strength I want to demonstrate. As Edward watched Catherine leave the cafe, he felt both relief and terror about what he had just set in motion. The secret that had burdened him for months was finally shared, but in sharing it, he had potentially ignited a crisis that could tear the royal family apart. The question now was what Catherine would do with the knowledge that her father-in-law privately questioned her character. Edward had the sinking feeling that he was about to find out exactly what kind of strength Catherine possessed after all. The confrontation came exactly 1 week after Edward's confession to Catherine, during what should have been a routine family dinner at Windsor Castle. Edward had spent those 7 days in a state of anxious anticipation, wondering how and when Catherine would address what she had learned about Charles's private opinions. He didn't have to wait long to find out. The dinner had been arranged to discuss the upcoming Commonwealth Day celebrations, with Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, and Edward all present to coordinate their various roles in the service and related events. The conversation had been proceeding normally, with detailed discussions of timing, protocol, and public engagements. Catherine had been her usual composed self throughout the meal, participating in the planning discussions with her characteristic attention to detail and thoughtful questions. Edward found himself watching her carefully, looking for signs of the turmoil he knew she must be feeling. But her public persona remained perfectly intact. It was during coffee service, as the conversation had turned to more general topics, that Catherine made her move. "Charles," she said, her voice calm and measured, "I wonder if we might discuss something that's been brought to my attention. Some concerns about my character and fitness for my role in this family." Edward felt the atmosphere in the room shift immediately. Charles looked genuinely puzzled, while Camilla's expression became carefully neutral. William glanced between his wife and father with obvious confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean," Charles said carefully. Catherine's smile was perfectly polite, but Edward could see the steel beneath it. "I've been told that there are questions about whether I possess the same strength as others in this family. Whether I've been properly tested. Whether I truly understand what sacrifice looks like." The color drained from Charles's face as he realized what was happening. His eyes moved briefly to Edward, who felt simultaneously guilty and relieved that the moment had finally arrived. "Catherine," Charles began, but she continued speaking. "I've been told that you believe I should experience what Camilla experienced, so that people would understand what real strength looks like." Her voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. William looked stunned. "Papa, what is she referring to?" Charles appeared to be struggling to find words, his usual diplomatic composure completely shaken. Camilla, meanwhile, had gone very still, clearly understanding that her husband's private thoughts had somehow become public knowledge. "I think," Catherine continued, "that we need to have an honest conversation about family dynamics and the assumptions that are made about people's character based on their experiences." "Catherine," Charles said, finally finding his voice, "if you overheard something taken out of context—" "I didn't overhear anything," Catherine interrupted. "About this family, felt I should know about the concerns being expressed behind my back." Edward felt William's gaze turn to him, and he nodded slightly in acknowledgement. William's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger. "You told her about a private conversation?" William asked Edward. "She asked me directly," Edward replied. She had heard, and she deserved an honest answer. "What conversation?" William demanded, turning to his father. "What concerns?" William demanded, turning to his father. "What concerns?" Charles looked trapped, his usual command of difficult situations completely absent. "It was a moment of frustration," he said finally. "Concerns about how different people are perceived by the public, about the challenges different people have faced."
What specifically did you say about my wife?
William's voice was dangerously quiet. Catherine answered before Charles could respond. "He questioned whether I have the same strength as Camilla, because I haven't been tested the way she was. He suggested that maybe I should face what she faced so people would understand what real strength looks like." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. William stared at his father with an expression of complete betrayal, while Camilla looked as if she wanted to disappear entirely. "You think Catherine is weak?" William asked, his voice filled with incredulous anger. "You think she needs to be what, punished? Tested?" paid to suffer to prove herself worthy of this family? That's not what I meant, Charles began.
Then what did you mean? William demanded.
Because it sounds like you've been sitting in judgment of my wife, comparing her unfavorably to your wife, and wishing she faced more hardship. Catherine placed a gentle hand on William's arm. Let him answer, she said quietly. Charles looked around the table at his family members, seeming to realize that there was no diplomatic way out of the situation he had created. I was frustrated, he said finally. Frustrated with how the public treats Camilla, with how she's still criticized and compared unfavorably despite everything she's endured. And yes, I wondered whether Catherine truly understands the depth of commitment and sacrifice that this role requires, based on what evidence? Catherine asked, her voice still calm but with an undercurrent of steel. What have I done or failed to do that suggests weakness or lack of commitment? Charles appeared to struggle with this direct challenge. It's not about what you've done. It's about the nature of your experience. You've been largely embraced by the public from the beginning. You've never faced sustained hostility or hatred. You've never had to prove yourself under truly adverse conditions. And you think that makes me weak? Catherine said. I think it leaves questions about untested strength, Charles replied. William stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is unbelievable. Catherine has given everything to this family, to this role. She's raised our children in the public eye, handled constant scrutiny, supported me through every challenge, and dedicated herself completely to her royal duties. And you're questioning her strength because the public happens to like her? Your father was speaking out of frustration about my situation, not making calculated judgments about Catherine. Don't, William said sharply, turning to Camilla. Don't defend this. He wasn't just frustrated about your treatment. He was actively criticizing my wife and suggesting she needs to suffer more to prove herself worthy. Catherine stood as well, her movement graceful and controlled. I think, she said, that this conversation has revealed some important truths about how I'm perceived within this family, and I think we need to address those perceptions directly. Directly. You want to know about my strength? About my commitment? About whether I understand sacrifice? Her voice was still controlled, but there was power in it now that Edward had never heard before. I gave up my private life at 25 to support William in this institution. I've spent 15 years having every outfit, every expression, every parenting choice analyzed and criticized. I've raised 3 children under constant media scrutiny, never knowing if they'll be safe from photographers when they leave the house. Catherine's composure was absolute, but her words carried increasing force. I've watched my husband struggle with the trauma of losing his mother and the pressure of his future role, and I've supported him through every moment of doubt and pain. Obeyed family dynamics that include his father's remarriage to the woman blamed for his mother's unhappiness. Edward watched Charles's expression change as Catherine continued, realizing perhaps for the first time the full scope of what she had actually endured and accomplished. I've managed all of this while maintaining perfect public composure, while never complaining, while always putting the institution first. And you think I'm untested? You think I need to experience hatred and hostility to prove my worth? Catherine paused, letting her words sink in. The difference between Camilla's experience and mine isn't that she faced challenges and I didn't. It's that she created some of her challenges through her choices, while I've had to navigate challenges that existed before I ever entered this family. The impact of Catherine's words was visible on Charles's face. Camilla had gone very pale, while William looked both proud of his wife and furious with his father. Catherine, Charles began, but she wasn't finished. I have tremendous respect for Camilla, Catherine continued, glancing at her stepmother-in-law. She showed courage and commitment in rebuilding her reputation and earning her place in this family. But her strength doesn't diminish mine, and her struggles don't invalidate my own. Catherine turned back to Charles. If you want to see real strength, Charles, look at what I've built rather than what I haven't destroyed. Look at how I've supported your son, how I've raised your grandchildren, how I've served this institution without ever seeking sympathy or making excuses. The room was absolutely silent as Catherine finished speaking. Edward realized he was witnessing a transformation, not just in Catherine, but in the entire family's understanding of who she was and what she represented. William moved to stand beside his wife, his hand finding hers. I have never been more proud of anyone in my life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Charles looked stricken, clearly realizing the full impact of his private judgments and their consequences. Catherine, I owe you an apology. My comments were unfair and based on incomplete understanding of what you've actually faced and accomplished. Galm is an emotion of friends. But more than that, you owe me a recognition of what I've actually contributed to this family, instead of focusing on what I haven't suffered. Catherine, I'm so sorry. I never wanted my experiences to be used as a measuring stick against yours. What Charles said was wrong, and I'm horrified that my situation was used to question your strength. Catherine turned to Camilla with genuine warmth. None of this is your fault, Camilla. You've been nothing but welcoming and supportive to me. This is about assumptions and comparisons that should never have been made. Charles finally found his voice properly. Catherine, I have been profoundly wrong. I let my frustration about public perception cloud my judgment about your character and contributions. You have shown remarkable strength, commitment, and grace throughout your time in this family. I am deeply sorry for questioning that, and for allowing my private concerns to undermine your confidence in your role. Thank you, Catherine said simply. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about private comments. It's about the way we see each other as family members, the assumptions we make, and the respect we show for different kinds of strength and sacrifice. Edward watched this exchange with a mixture of relief and admiration. Catherine had not only confronted the concerns about her character, but had completely reframed the conversation, forcing everyone to examine their assumptions and recognize her actual contributions. William addressed his father directly. Papa, Catherine is going to be queen one day. She needs your complete confidence and support, not your doubts and comparisons. Page. This conversation should never have been necessary. You're absolutely right, Charles replied. Catherine, I hope you can forgive not just my words, but my failure to properly recognize and appreciate everything you do for this family and this institution. The dinner ended with a very different atmosphere than it had begun. As family members prepared to leave, Edward found himself reflecting on the extraordinary evening he had witnessed. By telling Catherine about Charles's private comments, he had set in motion a confrontation that revealed not Catherine's weakness, but her formidable strength. Catherine approached Edward as he prepared to leave. Thank you, she said quietly, for being honest with me, and for giving me the opportunity to address this directly rather than letting it fester in silence. You handled this with incredible dignity, Edward replied. I think everyone learned something important tonight about who you really are. I hope so, Catherine said. But mostly I hope we can move forward as a family with better understanding and respect for each other. As Edward's car pulled away from Windsor Castle, he realized that his decision to break his silence had led to exactly the kind of crisis he had feared. But it had also led to a resolution that might never have been possible if the tensions had remained hidden. Catherine had indeed been tested, not by public hatred or sustained criticism, but by learning that her father-in-law privately questioned her character, and she had passed that test with a strength and grace that left no doubt about her fitness for the role she would one day inherit. The secret that had burdened Edward for months was finally out, but rather than destroying family relationships, it had ultimately strengthened them by forcing honest conversations about respect, strength, and the different ways people prove their worth. Sometimes, Edward reflected, the truth really could set people free, even when that freedom came at the cost of comfortable illusions and unexamined assumptions. Catherine had shown that night that she possessed exactly the kind of strength the monarchy needed. Not the ability to endure hatred, but the courage to demand respect and the wisdom to transform conflict into understanding. The royal family would move forward from this evening changed, but perhaps ultimately stronger for having confronted the hidden tensions and assumptions that had been undermining their relationships. And Catherine had proven beyond any doubt that she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.